Hi everybody! Thank you for your patience today. We had some technical issues on Buggy 1, but here we are again with our live chat, live from the coast of Churchill, Manitoba. We're on the shores of the Hudson Bay, and we're surrounded by polar bears right now. So thanks for joining. I'm Elisa McCall. We're going to talk for 45 to 60 minutes today, and please be sure to put your questions in the live chat window underneath your screen there. So today our visitor is Mike Lockhart. He's a biologist extraordinaire, and we're going to be talking about tracking polar bears. So if you have any questions, please let us know, and we'll get started with Mike. Mike, can you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your background?
Yeah, again, Mike Lockhart, and I'm a retired Fish and Wildlife Service biologist, 30-something years, but I worked mostly on birds of prey early in my career and did Fish and Wildlife Service research. Endangered species recovery, and then from 2001 to about 2011 I helped out on the North Slope with polar bears in both the Chukchi and Beaufort Sea with USGS and Fish and Wildlife Service projects doing the capture work mostly.
That's really neat. How many polar bears do you think that you've handled?
Oh my gosh, I don't know.
A lot.
Hundreds over the course of the years.
That's
yes.
really neat.
Yeah.
I was wondering, before we get into how we track polar bears, of course the first step is to capture the polar bears. And
Right.
can you maybe walk people through what that process is like?
Yeah, it's kind of an extraordinary thing. Obviously, you're based out of the north parts of Alaska, and you actually work on the sea ice. So you have housing in Prudhoe Bay and Barrow and Kaktovik, but you fly out every day over the sea ice in search of polar bears, and the bears are captured from helicopters and drugged. So you dart them from the air, and it's a long, tedious process. Sometimes you go out for hours and hours and hours and don't see any bears, and sometimes you see quite a few. We try to follow them by tracks. Once we find the track, we'll stay on it until we can find the bear, hopefully, and then it's a process of making sure that everything's safe. They're not near water or anything like that where they can get hurt after they get anesthetized. And you roll down the window, somebody hangs out the window and darts the bear, hopefully in the shoulder with a telazol dart, and puts them to sleep in a few minutes. And then you get out in the long process of putting a collar on, I guess we'll talk about, and taking measurements and blood samples and things like that. So it's a fun process. It can be pretty grueling and pretty cold out there, and you have to be careful with the weather and the conditions out on the ice and things like that.
Mm-hmm. It can be pretty dangerous, but I think we're getting more and more safety conscious as the year goes on for us and for polar bears.
Right.
If you could talk just for a minute about the telazol, because a lot of people that don't know about the drugs, maybe it doesn't sound so great that we're doing this, but actually the drug that we use on polar bears is extraordinarily safe for the bears.
Right, it is. I think early on in the history of doing immobilization work, there was some mixing of drugs and different things that were more dangerous. Telazol is incredibly safe.
Mm-hmm.
Even if the bear is accidentally overdosed, it's still very, very safe. And of course, the biologists take extreme care not to harass them any more than they have to, and dart them quickly out of the air, and then process them as quickly as possible. The drug wears off, anywhere from about an hour to a little more, and then you have to be very careful when you leave to make sure that there's no other polar bears around, that could hurt an incapacitated bear. But it's very safe and works very well.
Oh, that's really, really neat. And how long has your collaring program been going on up in Alaska? Do you know how many years they've been?
I've only been I sort of. I've been involved only with the capture part from 2001, but Dr. Steve Amstrup has been doing that for a long, long time, almost 30 years up there, and he's the one who kind of pioneered some of the early capture and telemetry work and some of the older forms of telemetry before the satellite. So they've been doing some form of capture and telemetry work for a long, long time.
That's really neat. And so you mentioned some older forms of telemetry. So when I got onto the scene of the telemetry stuff, I was very, very spoiled. So I used GPS collars for my work. And I'll get to that, but maybe you could talk a little bit about what you mean by VHF and what that's like to track a polar bear with that sort of collar.
Right. I don't have any experience myself with polar bears on anything other than satellite because of the timing that I came in. But the collars that we used in Alaska are a satellite component, and they also have a VHF component. So that if the collar falls off or something happens to the bear, you can use the VHF to actually find the collar. And so we did a lot of that. But the older type of telemetry that was done historically and that I used to do on a lot of other species was VHF. And it simply sends out a signal every second about, and you have to be within range, and it's a pretty it's a close range typically. If you're an aircraft, it can be farther, but you have to actually fly around and look for these bears or other wildlife and hear that signal. And then the antennas are directional, so you can fly the aircraft in a way that you can and eventually wear down that, look at a pattern, a search pattern where you can find them.
Yeah, and sometimes it's a pretty frustrating process. You're
Very.
wearing headphones, I assume, and you're listening to these different beeps in different ears, and you're trying to steer your pilot in the right direction from what you're hearing, and it can be a little frustrating. I know that we try to do that when we have a collar drop off. So we put collars on for about 2 years, and they're in this area anyway, and they're programmed to drop off automatically. And when they do, it is great if we can retrieve that collar. A, because they have downloadable data, so if some of our data wasn't taken up to the GPS satellite, it might still exist on that collar and we can get it back. And B, sometimes we can send that collar back down south and get it refurbished and then use it again. And this is a little bit cheaper because GPS collars are super, super expensive. So we have spent some time looking for these dropped collars in marshy environments and even some forested areas around here, and it's kind of a pain.
Yeah, and a lot of times it's a long time before you can get to the collar and it's covered with snow.
Yeah.
And then you have to dig them out, and it's very, very tedious to try and get that fine search pattern to find a collar that's under the snow and to dig it out.
Yeah, absolutely. And it actually is pretty uncommon that we get those collars back. A lot of times we just can't find them, or the VHF dies, or we think that they get dropped out when the bear is on the sea ice, and then that's a lost collar for us. But we are getting some new technology. I think we might move inside because this wind just wants to push my hair right in my face and I'm going to have trouble talking. So we're going to move inside and we're going to talk more about collars. Be sure to be putting your questions in the question box, the chat window. And don't forget to be checking out polarbearsinternational.org. Tomorrow I'm going to be talking more about Polar Bear Week and how you can help save our sea ice. So I'll talk a bit more about that later, but check that out. We got some buggies in the background too. We got lots of visitors today. We're popular. All right, let's head in. To our little warm workstation down here. So this is where Mike often sits when he's on the buggy with us on the weekend, and he's being a bit of everything. He's being a buggy co-pilot, you're adding knowledge to what we're doing, you're an extra pair of eyes out here, plus he's a fantastic photographer. So this is really great that we can chat with you today and get you on camera.
It's my pleasure. Fun.
Great. So one thing you might have noticed is I have a collar with me. So this is, it's a slightly older model, but it's still pretty representative of what we have. So this is a GPS collar. It also has the VHF antenna on it. So if the GPS part goes down, we can still track it with the radio frequency, which is really cool. And what we do out here now with these GPS collars is that this actually sends a signal to a GPS satellite. And I can sit in my office wherever I am in the world and I get emails sent to my inbox every few days. And I simply download these emails and I run them through this converter and I can map out where all our collared polar bears are on Hudson Bay. And you guys can see where some of the polar bears are too. We have a PBI, Polar Bears International Bear Tracker. And on the Bear Tracker we have some collared bears that we follow all year round. And we also have some southern Hudson Bay bears that we follow all year round. And Explore.org even has their own bear. And so we're going to be following this Explore.org bear all year and writing some blogs about her. She's got 2 young cubs right now. And we're going to see where they go throughout the year. All right, so I'm going to try to boot up some questions. Mike, do you have any stories or something you want to talk
Well,
about?
I think it's worthwhile to mention that when we collar bears, it's always the females.
It is. Let's talk about that. That's
Right.
a great point. Yeah.
The
Maybe you can talk
females
about that.
themselves have got a neck that will facilitate a collar. They have a small neck and a big head. The males, on the other hand, have a very large neck. And so if you put a collar, it would simply just slip off, or they could pull it off very quickly. So there haven't been any real effective ways of putting transmitters on males. There's been a lot of attempts to put glue-ons and ear tags and things like that with limited success. But there's a big question out there about the telemetry, the differences in behavior and activity patterns between males and females. And of course the females are probably the more important anyway, because it's more indicative of where the den sites are, where they're denning and things like that, which are pretty critical for our knowledge.
You're right, and that's a really good point to make. All my polar bear research has actually been using these collars, and so I've been following females from 1990 to 2011. I used all that data that we had, and it was all females that had cubs. Some were solitary, and we can compare how females use their area out on Hudson Bay, if they have young cubs, if they have older cubs, if they have no cubs, and we find some really interesting things about that. And we find that, for example, solitary females, they actually tend to stick a bit closer to land for whatever reason. So we might think that if a female doesn't have cubs to take care of, she can travel far and wide because she's pretty free to do what she wants, but that doesn't really seem to be the case. It seems that the females with the young cubs actually travel more. So these little cubs are having to walk a lot, but it's probably because they're looking for more food. That's what we think is happening, so that's pretty cool. But like Mike said, we really don't know what those males are doing. So if any of you kids are out there watching right now and you're interested in science and you're interested in polar bears, maybe you can become the next innovator of polar bear science and help us figure out a way to track these male polar bears, because that would be a pretty important piece of the puzzle, I think.
And just real quickly, the other part of what's being done, I mean, the telemetry aspect is very important. But the whole capture and mark recapture efforts on the sea ice are what tells us now more about what we know about bear populations and their population trajectory and things like that. Every time that the people go out to capture bears, they capture any bear that they encounter, and they get the sex and the age and all the vitals on it and what good a condition it's in. And then over the course of the years, these bears are individually marked. They're tattooed on the lips and they're given ear tags. So they have a reference of how many they're catching, new bears versus bears that have been previously caught. And they get very good data that way on survival and things like that. So it's a bigger project. The telemetry is one part of it, but the whole capture and mark recapture work is very, very important too.
That's a good point. We're not just capturing bears to put collars on them, of course. Like Mike said, there's a whole host of questions we ask when we capture a bear. We want to make sure that we made that worth it. Like, we took a couple hours out of that bear's life. It was asleep and it wasn't doing what it wanted to be doing, and so we need to make sure that data really adds to our knowledge about polar bears. And so we take all sorts of measurements when we're out there, like Mike said, size, we take blood samples sometimes, fur samples. In polar bear fur, we can measure the amount of cortisol, for example, so that's a stress hormone, and we can see if polar bears are getting more stressed. So all these things like this, they're just so critical. And something that's really exciting, that's kind of becoming newer, but more common, is the genetic stuff. So our genetic research and our DNA research, it's becoming cheaper and more accessible, and so we have samples from polar bears dating back to the 80s that we've done a little bit with, but we haven't really been able to push that knowledge because we didn't have the technology. But now that we have all this new exciting DNA research and options and labs, we can use these old samples and compare them to current samples, and we can see what's going on with the population structure. Right now there's someone in my old lab at the University of Alberta, and she's breaking down whether we need to reassess some boundaries in Hudson Bay. So right now, we're in Hudson Bay, and the bears right around us are the western Hudson Bay polar bears. Now we also have a population a little farther south, the southern Hudson Bay polar bears, and then the farther north one is the Fox Basin polar bears. And scientists kind of made up these borders in Hudson Bay a while ago based on a few different things. And right now we're wondering, do we need to reassess these borders? Do these borders we use for management actually describe these different populations? Is there a lot of movement? And one thing I've noticed actually with our GPS collar data is that we do have females that travel far to other populations. So most of the females that we have in this population, they will den in Wapusk, so right near here. And they'll come back every year in the summer. But some of them like to go to Ontario, and we don't know why. Is it because maybe their dad is a southern Hudson Bay bear? Did they learn that from their mom? We had a female also den up in Nunavut, and why did she do that if she was born in this area right here? So these are questions that we can ask and learn more about if we have this collar data and the genetic data and all these amazing samples. So we still have so much to learn about polar bears. And it's a really exciting field. And actually, you were on this drone project this week. You were out with the group that was flying the drones. Another way to maybe assess polar bear populations.
Yeah, I think and I don't understand a lot of the details of what they're trying to do, but they're looking at a certain spectrum of light that they can. They're flying these drones over these bears to look at the color of the bears. And see if that has any application for satellite surveys. I guess there's been some surveys where they've done with bears on land, white bears on land, where they could get accurate counts of bears. And I think they're trying to expand that onto pack ice, so that there's a actual survey technology that could be developed from a satellite, given the colors of polar bears, which is a little different than the white. It's a little off yellow. So if that works out, that'd be a great promise. One of the things that's really hard to do is survey polar bear populations. The mark recapture data gives us the best estimates we have currently, but if there was satellite technology that we could get where we could get large coverage of large areas and pretty refined data on numbers, that would be wonderful.
It really would be. So maybe with that, we'll start taking a couple questions and see where we go. So we have a question from So Caliph. When collaring the female who has cubs, do the cubs stay nearby despite what's happening? Can you talk a bit about what we do?
We gotta.
Actually, you guys, we need to take a break. Hang on, look what we have outside
right by
here.
us.
I'm just gonna be quiet for a minute. Perfect timing.
Yeah. You know, 2 cuts.
Yeah. Female with 2 young cubs of the year. So they're about 10 months old right now. Oh, well, 1 month, I guess. Look at that.
Wow.
Lisa, do you want to take this back on the back deck?
Yeah, sure.
Let's just move it back outside.
Wow.
So this is a cool part about a live chat. Things like this happen. It's pretty interested in what we're doing out here. We don't have any other buggies around, which is pretty special, watching them on the cubs. There are a few males in the area that I think she's just aware of and sniffing out to make sure they're not getting too close, but she's a pretty confident mother. The cubs follow mom just so closely. It's pretty special. It's so quiet out here right now, watching this. There's another bear over to the right. There's 2 bears over to the right actually walking, so we'll just
I think Mom's keeping an eye on them. Could someone get the tripod? No cords. They're so close right now. So these are just the type of families that we call her because we want to learn more about them and what the mom's doing with the cubs. And then our hope is that if we learn about what type of habitat they like, when they go, certain places, that maybe we can help conserve those places for the future if they're so critical to the females with cubs. We know that they're super, super important. So that means that scientists have captured her before and we know a little bit about her. Of course, I don't know that right now because I can't see the number on her ear tag. But we know there is some information about her out there, which is fantastic. That one guy wants to sit. See her yawning. So we mentioned before, yawning, she could either be smelling what's around her or maybe just a little bit unsure about what to do about a few things. So it could be a displacement behavior is what we call it. I think she's probably just smelling the air. Cubs seem to be smelling the air whenever she does too. Waits for them to catch up. Pretty neat stuff, especially it's so quiet out here. It's awesome. One last look. There's two bears getting pretty close actually over to her right. I think that's why she's moving away to the left. Great day out here in the tundra for watching some action. See, now if we could learn how to track males, we could look at the overlap between males and moms with cubs and see how often they come into contact potentially. Looks like this bear in front's not super happy with the big bear behind him. He's trotting a little bit now. Pretty neat stuff. Can you pick that guy up? Are you seeing him?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a pretty big guy. He's a little bit thin, but you can tell he's a big bear. I think the bears must be in good spirits those last couple days because the little ponds are freezing over now. We've got snow on the ground. It's getting a little bit colder. So that's pretty great. I'm not too disturbed by much up here. Well, maybe we could head back inside. We'll get that guy up on the polar bear cam, on buggy 1 cam. It doesn't look like he's going to come much closer to us. He's kind of heading down the coast there, so maybe we'll move inside, but we're going to keep an eye out. We can pop out to the back deck again if we need to, for sure. But we're going to get the buggy 1 cam on those guys. Alright. Come back into the warm.
I did. It's pretty special.
We'll share a couple of those photos on store.org later. We'll get some that Mike shot. That's pretty cool, you guys. That was a pretty neat moment.
Yeah, very
Yeah.
special.
Yeah, I think that's the closest I've been to that mom and cub since the season started. So, man, neat stuff. Very, very cool. So we'll get back to the question. Right when that happened, when you're collaring a female with cubs, what are the cubs doing at that moment? What's...
Oh, that's a very good point. And of course, cubs of the year are small, and sometimes they try to run away. You have to be very careful. You have to surround them and try to grab them, and then you grab them, you put a rope over their neck so that you restrain them from running off, because they can run pretty fast even when they're small. And then they are also given a very small injection of Tilazol to put them to sleep. And they also are marked individually. They get tattoos and ear tags as well, so we can identify them in years to come if we catch them. The older cubs, the yearlings, and the 2-year-old cubs that are still with mom, they are also either darted or they're all darted, but the yearlings can be darted from the ground, and the 2-year-olds typically are a little bit more mobile, so they're usually darted from the helicopter.
Okay, neat. So we never separate a mom from her cubs, and I think that's always kind of our number one
Critical.
concern.
Yep.
Yeah, we never let them get separated. Okay, so Mike, do you know at all kind of the ratio of males to females in the polar bear world?
Boy, I don't, to tell you the truth. I would assume that it's close to 50-50, but I really don't know for sure. I'm sure that information is out there, and capture, mark, recapture work is will be very telling on that.
I think so. I think I've heard in this area there are slightly more females. I can't give us a percentage for sure, but slightly more females just because, males, they have a lot of pretty stiff competition. They get hurt
Right.
more often, so maybe not as many of them make it to the older age, whereas more females can.
That's
do live
that's a
bit
very
longer.
good point. When you catch the male, a lot of times they're really scarred up and battle worn, and the females usually are pretty clean and pretty immaculate. They obviously don't fight as much.
Right, and we have a few old males out, well, I shouldn't say old, but older males out here that do have some pretty specific facial scarring, so we're not sure how many of them will, hang out or come too close. I know there's one, and I think we have a video of him on Explorer. He's got 2 scars kind of right under his nose, and I know there's a few buggy drivers out there calling them old 4 eyes, so maybe we'll keep an eye out for 4 eyes. Here we go. So this is a great question, and it's something that we've actually talked about on the buggy, just amongst ourselves, but let's bring it up. So Donna T. Bennett is wondering, is microchipping an option for males, or is the ability or lack thereof to scan those chips a factor?
That's a great question, and they have been looking at that technology, and unfortunately, the chips, you have to get so close to read them that we can't even do it from aircraft yet.
Right.
So it would be nice if they had a technology that they could fly over and take that reading from a bear. And if they could do that, then there would be no need for capturing it at all. The only reason to capture them is to find out who they are. And if you had a microchip and you could do that, then you would just be able to pass right by that bear. You'd have its location and who it is.
Yeah, and maybe one day soon that will be an option. We need a few advances, but that would definitely be pretty amazing.
Great question.
Great question. Let's look at, okay, so there's a question from Dale55. How many webcams do you have throughout the area, and how many bears are you following? So first, the webcams, I assume you mean our live cams right now. So we have several live cams out. We have, more than several. We have 2 on the Tundra Buggy Lodge. So the Tundra Buggy Lodge is actually behind us right now. It's in the middle of the tundra. It's a bunch of cars linked together where people sleep and eat and have a great time on the tundra. And we have a cam that faces north on the lodge and a cam that faces south on the lodge. So thank you to Frontiers North Adventures for helping us with this and putting these live cams on their buggies. We also, of course, have our Buggy 1 cam right here, right now. It's just over to the side. And we also have 1 cam or 2 cams at Cape Churchill. So that's in Wapaka National Park. They're mounted on a tower, and you can see some really great bear action out there. So the other question, how many bears do you track? Right now in the Western Hudson Bay, we have 20 collars out. So we usually collar a maximum of 10 bears a year, and those collars last for 20 years. In the Southern Hudson Bay, they're tracking another, I think, 12 to 20 bears, and then Fox Basin has some going on. So I think every population, well, the ones that we're able to, will track. Certainly not all there's 19 polar bear subpopulations, I should say that, and certainly not all of them have tracked polar bears. We actually are lacking data for quite a few of those subpopulations. They're just so hard to get to, and depending on the country and the region, and we really don't know a lot about quite a few polar bear populations. So there's so much that we can still learn about these bears. Okay, a question about seals from Patty Moo. So Mike, do you know, the question is, when do the seals come out? Can you talk a little bit about the seals at all, or what they're doing when...
I don't know a lot about the biology of seals, but they're always out. They're
Exactly.
out there, they're in the water, and of course the ice seals depend on the ice just as much as the polar bears do. They depend on it for their pupping areas and to come out and to haul out. And of course that's how polar bears find their food, is they find them on the ice. But they're always out there, and when there's ice off, they're out in the water still. I don't know enough about the ice seals to whether they actually come out to haul out on land or not. Do you?
I've heard it happens rarely in this region. I think there's certain areas they do more, like on the little islands and things like that once in a while, but it's definitely not a common thing. And if a polar bear were to find a hauled out seal on land, that would be a great day.
Yeah.
Very rare. That would be winning a mini lottery. So it's not something we expect to see. It is definitely, they need that ice. The polar bears need that ice to find the seals. And of course, the seals, the ice seals anyway, they breed on the ice. So they have their pups in a layer on the ice covered in snow, and that's where they have their babies. So if we didn't have that sea ice, then we wouldn't have seals breeding. And of course that causes issues for the entire Arctic ecosystem.
I've heard that that's one of the big gaps in our knowledge and related to polar bears is the ice or the ice seal information. I don't know if there's a
It is
lot
a
of data on
Not enough
seals, but certainly that's something that needs to be researched more.
Yeah, and that's another issue similar to polar bears. Seals are so hard to study, maybe even harder because they're underwater most of the time, and we really can't cover a lot of the area that the seals are living in. So we're kind of restricted as humans to studying along the coast. I know there was a project out of, I think it was the University of Manitoba, that tracked a few seals, which was great information. We didn't know anything about that before, but I know there's still so much we can learn, even about the breakdown of what seals of what species are in the bay. That would be really helpful for us to know. Very helpful. So, another question from Dale55. Is there an issue with poachers for the polar bears? And if so, what is being done?
I don't know much about that. The harvest of polar bears is pretty well regulated, and it's against the law in most countries except for First Nations. I've heard that in some countries there's greater levels of poaching. I don't think that that's much of a problem in Canada and the United States, but I don't know.
And I'm not sure either. I mean, I don't think we have any real information on poaching. I think the people that are allowed to hunt polar bears, in Canada at least, they take that very seriously. There's a quota, it's part of their culture. They very much respect the polar bear, and I don't think that they would take very kindly to people coming in and poaching polar bears. I think we're all kind of working together to make sure we have polar bears long into the future. And poachers, I would hope that, there'd be few and far between, and that they'd be reported if there were any. So we're hoping that that's not a big issue. The biggest issue for polar bears, really, even if there were more poachers out there, at the end of the day, the big issue is loss of habitat. So the Arctic sea ice is melting. The temperature is just getting too warm in our atmosphere. The ice is decreasing in its regularity here. So in western Hudson Bay, the ice already is freezing up later on average and breaking up earlier on average. And this means that polar bears have less time on the sea ice to hunt seals, and they're spending more time here on land. And while we love seeing them on land, we get to watch them, they're really not, they don't have any calories. They're hungry. They haven't eaten for months. They're snacking on kelp, you'll see that. They snack on berries. Maybe you can find some goose eggs, things like that, but they're not getting that seal fat that they really need. And so really, at Polar Bears International, our message is to, help polar bears by saving the sea ice. And next week is Polar Bear Week, November 2nd to 8th. And if you visit polarbearsinternational.org, you will see a variety of resources and exciting things that we're going to be doing this week. And I'm going to talk much more in detail about that tomorrow, how you can take the next step to help polar bears. And we're going to have an energy challenge every day. It's going to be super exciting stuff. We have lots of people that are going to be here, lots of really amazing experts, and we'll be hosting a lot of live chats. And we really hope that you guys want to get involved. And in fact, we would love to see what you're doing to help polar bears. Even in the chat window, if you're doing something like you're making a conscious effort to walk more instead of driving, if you're recycling, composting, anything like that, reducing, reusing, recycling, that old mantra, it still holds true. All these little things add up over time and really help polar bears. And I know it maybe sounds funny, but it absolutely is true. We can really all do a big part, and especially if we get all you viewers doing something, that's amazing. And thank you so much for watching it all. So I'll see if there's just one or two more questions, and then is there anything else you want to mention, Mike?
No, I don't think so. The only thing I would say is that polar bears are the large charismatic species for climate change, but climate change is a huge problem worldwide and for a lot of species, and there's great biodiversity questions and impacts that are happening resulting from climate change, and I don't think we know a lot about it, but it's a huge threat, and it's an immediate threat, and we need to take some pretty strong action to try to curb that. And there's no sense in taking any chances, really, and messing around and trying to get more science. I think everything that can be done to help it at this point is really, really important.
Absolutely.
We've got to turn it around.
Yeah, and we saw that mom and cubs today, and those cubs are going to be learning to hunt with their mom this year, and they really, they're going to need all the help they can get. If we have a really bad ice year one year, they're going to struggle to find food, is just what it boils down to. And we really hope that doesn't happen, but it's getting harder and harder to predict what the ice is going to do each year. So we can keep our fingers crossed. and we'll see what happens. But we all want to do our part to make sure that those cubs grow up into super healthy adults who are hunting lots of seals. Maybe the seals won't like that, but we like that. So the last question I might take for now, and then we'll get back to your questions in the chat window later, so don't worry. Katie asks, was it exciting to see the polar bear cubs walk by, or are you bored because you've seen so many? Do you ever get bored of seeing the polar bears out here?
No. It's very exciting. It always is.
Yeah, it's really an amazing experience. And when they walk by, you know, we might be kind of hushed or, you know, trying to contain ourselves. Like, we don't want to scare those bears away, but I can tell you it's really an amazing moment. And we have biologists. Well, I mean, Mike, you've been a biologist for 40 years. We've got people who've been studying polar bears for 30 years that come up here. I think when anyone sees, well, a polar bear, let alone a mom and cubs, it's, you know, it's a breathtaking experience. It's something you can never get bored of. If I ever do get bored of that, I don't know. We gotta do something about that. There's gonna be something else going on in my life for that to happen. So, oh, that's so exciting. Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in today. We're gonna be in the chat window throughout the day. We're gonna upload some pictures. We're gonna be keeping an eye on what's happening out here. Polar Bear Week next week. Please join us. Join me tomorrow, Sunday. I'm gonna talk all about what we're doing, the exciting programs we have for you, and how you can take the next step to help polar bears. So with that, I want to say thank you so much to Explore.org. They help us fund these cams and run these cams through their Pearls of the Planet project. Frontiers North Adventures. They donate us Buggy 1. So this buggy we're on right now, that's from Frontiers North Adventures, and we couldn't do any of this without them. We would also love to thank Parks Canada. They do a great job managing Wapusk National Park, which is a major, major denning area for those moms and cubs, and they make sure that they're all taken care of. And with that, I also need to say happy birthday to my mom. Sorry I couldn't be there today, but I'm out here watching Polar Bear Moms, but I'll call you later. So thanks everybody for tuning in, and we will talk to you really soon. Bye.